We're talking about the politics of the African continent, how it interacts with some of the elements of the politics in East Asia, the broader push for the United States for a new Cold War with China, and of course, the issue of African prosperity. And we are very honored, as always, to be joined by a friend of the show, Mikaela Erskog, who has many hats. Member of the Secretariat of Pan-Africanism today, a researcher at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, member of No Cold War, but most importantly, the co-host of the new show, The Crane, an Africa-China podcast from DongSheng News Collective. Mika, as always, thank you so much for being with us here on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Well, we are very glad to have you here. We're honored, I might say. I wanted to start here with a story that I think is relatively interesting. It certainly flew under the radar until the producer of the show brought it up to me, flew under my radar, I should say. And that is recently China, which of course is always accused and was just recently accused by Blinken multiple times in his trip to Africa. China, which is always accused of trying to dominate Africa, has now entered into negotiations, I guess, to have, I think it's 6 or 7 African countries, some of the least developed nations. I know Eritrea is one of them, Sudan's one of them. There's a few others off the top of my head, you can tell me. But to essentially eliminate tariffs on the vast majority of goods coming from those countries into China, so giving significant market access. And it doesn't seem to me like you give significant market access when you're trying to just totally determine, control countries. So I'm curious what you think about this. I mean, tell us a little bit more about it if you would, but also what you think this really means in terms of what we hear about the China-Africa relationship and the reality of it.
Sure thing. So I think this is it's an important conversation to have right now, especially because I think people are kind of misconstruing the impact of it, specifically around the fact that, in the last few years, we've seen how the US and Australia and others have heavily sanctioned China, have, increased tariffs on various goods, and it's been a huge, cost to China. So a lot of Western media is actually framing the recent proposition by the Chinese government that they're going to cut these import tariffs to these 16 low-income countries, which, as you mentioned, Eritrea, Djibouti, Rwanda, Mozambique, Sudan, many others, but almost to frame it as if this is China's way of kind of turning away from the West. But even though it's significant and it's an important step, Africa is a relatively small part of China's total trade volume. So just for context, it's only about 4% of China's total trade volume is with Africa, which is still more than if you compare with like the US, where I think China-US trade volume is around 1%. This is despite the fact that they made a huge deal about AGOA in 2000, but they've not managed to do anything of any significance in terms of increasing the trade volume. But this recent development basically will allow about 98% of all the taxable products coming from those countries to be totally, tax-free. And this covers around 8,700 or so different products. And of course, for countries like, let's take Mozambique, which has had an interesting relationship with China, where we've had some interesting projects around agriculture with the agricultural development centers there for the last decade and a half or so. It could be a really important space because they've been developing, hybrid rice. They've been developing junkao, which is a type of mushroom that grows very cheaply, very quickly. Those kinds of products, if we start to see them being produced on a bigger scale, could really benefit Mozambique in terms of their exports to China.
It's so interesting, Mika, because we always hear in the Western media that China is locking poor countries all across Africa, as well as Asia as well, in these debt traps. And of course, what you're talking about, is kind of the opposite of that. But I'm curious if you can speak to that propaganda talking point we hear so often, is that these African countries are getting locked into like Chinese debt trap diplomacy.
Sure. I think one of the conversations we had recently on a podcast we've launched called The Crane, an Africa-China podcast, is precisely around this question of debt trap. And there are a couple of baggage that weighs this conversation down. One is the fact that just because China has had this, massive engagement with the continent, we saw recently they're reporting around, I think we're now at 254 billion, which was a massive increase from 2020 to 2021. That's 35%. And that's huge in terms of the pandemic and everything that's been happening in the last few years. But the increased presence of China and the engagement with the African continent has, of course, created these narratives around neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism, when if we look at the kind of qualitative and the quantitative aspects to it, it looks very different from classical colonialism, let alone neo-colonialism, which we've seen on the African continent since the kind of 1960s, 1970s independence, post-independence period. But a couple of things around the narrative of debt trap diplomacy that are false is, one, there goes the question of when we enter into these agreements, it's normally a predatory agreement where if we, aren't able to pay for the agreement, we're likely to get our national assets seized, and those kinds of things always appear, interestingly, just before China is about to have some kind of important public engagement. Last year, a couple of months before the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in November of 2021 in Dakar, Senegal, we saw 2 months before that the story about the Entebbe International Airport in Uganda apparently was going to be seized if they defaulted on their loan repayment, which was, when we looked at the facts, when you look at the actual data, it was incorrect. When you looked at the agreement, the only issue that we could raise as a concern is that the Ugandan government had failed to really look at some of the aspects of the agreement in relation to their ability to pay back those loans. And aside from that, what we have with also Chinese loans is they're often lower interest rates than any of the Western institutions. They are longer maturing periods. They've often allowed for actual infrastructure to come up rather than what we see in the case of Western financial institutions, where we're told to privatize our national resources. We're told to take funding out of our public services in order to basically agree to those loans. But with China, we don't see those same kinds of conditionalities and interference. So ultimately, it is up to our own governments to try to negotiate for stronger economic positions and advantages when it comes to these agreements.
I think that's such an important point. I mean, I've heard it said before, Africa doesn't have a China problem, it has a capitalism problem, looking at the root causes of this. And but what you're saying just speaks so clearly to me, because obviously we just had Blinken do his little trip to Africa. You had Linda Thomas Greenfield before then. But it was just so striking to me because he gets there for the U.S. South Africa strategic dialogue. And, the whole thing is like, we're going to do so much for Africa. We have this new thing for Africa. And then he has nothing to announce. And I just thought, usually when China does something big on Africa, they announce like 100 big projects all at once. And Blinken was like, yeah, we're going to do something at some point in the future. And it's just like, it feels that the U.S. and Western approach is so cynical in the fact that it really has nothing to do with Africa. It's just like, oh, China's doing something, well, we're going to do something. But then they have nothing to announce, nothing to say. He's in DRC, and he's like, you know what we got to do? We got to protect the rainforest in DRC, and they need a lot of money. They need a lot of money to protect these rainforests. So what we're going to do, we're going to set up a task force. And I just thought, like, what is this? But to me, it just seems so maybe appropriately revealing, Mika, to see Blinken's trip through the African continent, because it seemed to me to reflect how little the West really has to offer, at least the broad masses of African people.
No, definitely. And I think there were two things that stood out to me with his visit is, one, on the one hand, he's apparently proposing that Africa, you can choose who your partners should be, like, we don't want to interfere with you, but then doubles back by saying, but watch out for Russia, watch out for China. And all of this is in the US, the document that they released, the US strategic position towards Africa, or sub-Saharan Africa, that came out in August. And in it, even though there's a lot of fluff around trying to determine an independent relationship with Africa, if you scan through it, it's very clear that they're trying to increase their competitive position against China and Russia and any other kind of foreign or other international groups who want to engage with Africa. And then the other part that I thought was interesting is, obviously, I'm an activist in South Africa. South Africa has a deeply egalitarian society, and we have our challenges with the government. But it was useful to see that Naledi Pandor, the foreign minister, did say, we don't want to be brought into your big competition and the kind of new Cold War that you're trying to advance. We want to stay out of it. So I think even though I think it's clear to a lot of African leaders that the US has nothing concrete to offer us, and nothing material is going to emerge from this. What we have seen, and especially since the Ukraine war, is that Africans do not want to be, rallied along to be, kind of like servants, essentially, right, slaves to the Western agenda, and especially the US agenda. Whilst, as you said, on the other hand, China has offered us, you were mentioning, they come with many proposals, and with the FOCAC forum, we had, particularly around, if we think about trade and agriculture, they want to have 10 connectivity projects this year, 10 agricultural and poverty reduction projects. They want to send 500 agricultural experts. And so even this recent announcement about the cuts to the tariffs is something that they announced then, but now we're seeing more of the details come up. So we are looking forward then to seeing more of the details that will be arising around some of these projects that are yet to unfold.
And it is interesting. Yes, the U.S. doesn't have anything to offer except for one thing, and that is military expansion. You actually, Mika, you worked on this report that you and I have talked about in the past on dispatches. You worked on a report for the Tricontinental Institute. I believe it was published last year, basically on Western imperialism across Africa. And one thing that comes up is AFRICOM, which has, was created in 2007. It's so funny to me that AFRICOM can't have a base, and it doesn't have a base in Africa. It's actually based in Germany, which I just think that's hilarious, but it's AFRICOM. But the expansion of AFRICOM, like alongside this kind of escalation of US and kind of like allied foreign military bases across Africa, is something that's happened in parallel to the rise of this new Cold War. I'm curious if you could just speak to that military expansion. I also recently spoke to Vijay Prashad about this, about the actual expansion of NATO across Africa in conjunction with AFRICOM.
Sure. And before I do, I just want to mention, and I think this is something that isn't well known, is that NATO is a direct result, AFRICOM is a direct result of NATO. Because in fact, the then director of, before in 2004, he was I'm blanking on his name, Jones Jr. He was the director both of the European Command as well as working in NATO. And he was the one who proposed, actually, we need to prepare the landscape for our future plans. And that's where AFRICOM then arose from. So when people are like, what does this have to do with NATO? It is directly emerging from that organization. And so, recently we've seen a few months ago in Zambia that AFRICOM has proposed that they want to have a liaison office, which, for us, that raises a lot of eyebrows, because when we did our research on this dossier at Tricontinental on foreign militarization across the continent, what is often not very easy to quantify is a more clandestine presence of AFRICOM, where we obviously a military base looks very clear. You can identify it. You can see it through surveillance cameras and space cameras. I don't know the word for it, but you can see it and identify it. But what we've saw when we looked at the example of Ghana and the use since 2018 of the international airport, the Kotoka International Airport in Ghana, is that the US, through AFRICOM, is able to make these arrangements to basically move freely, use freely, various national infrastructure of African nations. And so this recent conversation that's been happening in Zambia gives us pause and gives us concern that even though they might not build a physical military base, they'll be able to operate freely and without kind of any consequence or accountability. So there we're seeing a rise. And of course, as developments are happening with Ukraine, there is a concern that there will be, increasing flow of arms that then will give the US an excuse to have to, return to fight the war on terror in the different formats it might take in future.
No, it's a very good point. It's a scary point in a lot of ways. I mean, you look at this Italy conference, I guess it was last year, about countering ISIS or whatever in Africa. And I think one of the things Blinken announced is how they're going to support the SADC mission in Mozambique. And when the U.S. says they're going to support any military mission, that's always a scary piece. And I mean, it does feel that, you know, in a way, it's you know, Africa is still a shadow battleground in many ways in this sort of new Cold War, but it does feel to me like, in a way, sort of the crucial battleground. I mean, it's the youngest continent. Obviously, a huge amount of natural resources are there. And I mean, I could be wrong about this, but it does feel that to some degree, when you look at things like the African Continental Free Trade Area, you know, other different pieces, that sort of whether or not Africa is going to have some sort of self-determining future where people's lives can be improved or not is very heavily dependent on whether or not these sort of, you know, Western military interventions sort of carry the day, or whether or not there's perhaps a new development paradigm that could be introduced into the continent.
Yeah, and I think although there are a lot of issues and a lot of challenges that we're facing, I think, as I mentioned before, the fact that a lot of African countries, at least, you know, it was half the African countries didn't vote in the UN resolution in March to condemn Russia, as well as most didn't vote for sanctions against Russia. I think at least on the kind of state level, that is at least a bit hopeful, because we can then hold our governments accountable not to take the side of the US and not to invest in kind of Western projects and allow for further intervention. And we've also seen, I mean, in the last decade, non-violent mass mobilizations have been happening consistently. I mean, we salute the people in Sudan who for the last, 5 years have continued to mobilize at a mass level to kind of reclaim their country. But when Mali earlier this year ejected the French military, whatever you might say about the Mali military government, it still opens up a kind of crack that we could possibly see more social movements and progressive organizations try to claim that space and try to push back against Western militarization, Western intervention in the African continent. And I mean, we're seeing, the kind of diminishment that's happening in the Ukraine, and I don't think any African country wants to go along with it, as we saw also with Zelensky's failed, summit with African leaders, where I think it was only like 4 different African leaders were there, which included Macky Sall, who was the head of the African Union, the Senegalese president, so it doesn't really count as a representative of an African government, as well as the way he tried to recruit young African soldiers, which, was completely...
Yeah.
But,
and what else is there to say, right?
But we still, in the African continent, have the crucial mission, wherever we find ourselves, of how are we developing internally processes that might advance our development. Because even with our relationship with China, if we still look at the levels of productivity in agriculture, for example, we're nowhere near meeting not only the needs of our own continent, but the needs of any other people who want to import from us. Because right now, Africa has 60% arable land in the largest continent that can fit 3 Europes in it, that can fit 3 United States in it, but we're still lagging behind because of the historical heritage of colonialism and underdevelopment and neoliberalism.
Well, Mika, before we let you go, just tell us about the new podcast that you're the co-host of, The Crane. For anyone who cares about these issues, this is a very exciting development.
Thank you so much. So as a member of the DongSheng collective, which in the last few years, we've been trying to get more news, more information about what's happening in China. Myself and a colleague, Amadeus Musamali, who's based in Zambia, we are now, we started this podcast called The Crane, which is supposed to invoke, development like a crane machine, but also the flight of actual crane birds, because they're both indigenous to China as well as to the African continent. And so in this podcast, which comes out every 2 weeks on a Friday, we'll be trying to delve into some of the issues around China-Africa. We're trying to do it, of course, from a more left perspective with a class analysis, and also coming from young African people who are invested in these kinds of conversations. So we'll be interviewing people, we'll be having historical conversations, but we also want to have contemporary conversations that might help not only ourselves inform what's actually going on, but think about what are the ways forward for us in our international relationships and our own social development.
Right on. Well, we will do what we can to share it. So, folks, definitely look out for the Crane and Africa China podcast. As always, Mika, we really appreciate you joining us here on the Freedom Side and giving us some of your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.